Thank you so much for this much too generous introduction. Thank you. And I would like to also thank Director Juan Ponce for this kind welcome. I would like to thank you as head of the Department of Political Studies, Felipe Burbano, for your warm introduction, and I would especially like to thank Associate Professor Cornelia Rogaband, as she is known here. We call her Connie, for making it possible for me to come and speak to the most important FLACSO in Latin America. I am so pleased to be here. I might even say, if you will forgive my Italian, sono emozionato. Do you say that in Spanish?
Yes. Estoy muy emocionado.
It is a wonderful experience for me, and I thank you very much for this opportunity. This is a cycle of lectures that is a little different than the usual cycle of lectures, in that I will be speaking on 3 different subjects. The first subject, which Professor Burbano has already mentioned, is the language of contention, and I will talk about it today. The second is the subject of the book I'm currently working on the subject of war and social movements, an interdisciplinary attempt to look at the relationships between domestic contention and international war. And then the third talk will be something completely new for me, in which I will attempt to expose my ignorance about Latin America by comparing the contentious responses of Europeans and Latin Americans to different economic crises. And this is a subject I hope to work on in the future because, as you can tell, I'm still very young and I have many, many subjects to work on before I'm finished. So let me begin with the concept of the repertoire of contention. And will someone tell me how to turn the, is it this? Okay, good. Thank you very much. So I begin with a key concept in the teaching of Charles Tilly, the concept of the repertoire of contention. And this concept has 2 dimensions. The first is very obvious. It's what people do when they engage in contentious politics. But there's a second dimension which is equally important, and it's what people know how to do. It's the habitual, expected, legitimized forms of contentious politics. And in history, there are remarkably few innovations in what people know how to do and what is accepted in contentious politics. And so as we study the historical development of contention, we can study it through the changes in the repertoire, not only in what people do, but in what they know how to do. And the repertoire has 3 different kinds of sources. The first is the past practice of contention in a particular society. The second is the forms that others have used successfully. And the third are the forms that are legitimated by the state, by the court system, and by movement organizations. Now, each of these 3 sources has an intimate connection to the language of contention. And that's what I'm going to talk about today. The past practice is handed down through the language of contention. protesters learn about the forms that others have successfully used by hearing about them, by reading about them, and most recently, through social media. And finally, the language of contention is deeply affected by the language that is accepted by the courts, by the government, and by social movement organizations. For example, the term for strike in French, la grève, was only accepted as legitimate by the French state in the late 19th century. Strikes were going on from the beginning of industrialization, but because the French state associated the word grève with working class power, they refused to accept the use of the word until working class organizations forced it upon them. So there are three main points I would like to make in this talk about the language of contention. The first is that this is a language that is polysemic. That is, its meanings change with the historical period and with the context in which the term is used. Think of the word terrorism. It began with the French Revolution, but it was not a word associated with the actions of non-state actors. It was associated with the actions of the state. Robespierre regarded terror and virtue as the main cardinal points of his government. Terrorism was state action, and it was only as the practice of organized violence moved further eastward and southward to Russia and Italy that the term changed its valence from state terror to terrorism against the state. As the political context changed, the meaning of terrorism changed with it. And that's my first point. The language of contention is polysemic. My second point is that the language of contention changes according to the structural context: state building, industrialization, economic crisis. But it also responds to changes in political opportunities and constraints, as we will see with the language of citizenship during and after the transition in Latin America. Finally, I will argue that the language of contention both unifies and divides, such as the difference between individual and collective citizenship that I'll talk about in Latin America towards the end of my talk. Let me begin, however, with three apologies. First, the words I'm going to examine will mainly be words in English, although I'll make an attempt to look at the diffusion of contentious language into other languages. Second, I will not be able to speak in depth about any particular form of contention. And third, I won't be able to talk about the interesting cover of my book, which I hope some of you will purchase and even read. You may be interested, if you look carefully, and I'm not sure you can see this, that the couple who are celebrating their marriage are carrying a banner which says, in English, "just married." You might have thought that this same-sex marriage was taking place in an English-speaking country. But if you look more carefully, no, you can't quite see it. The signs in the background are all in French, because this same-sex marriage was taking place in Lyon, in France. Yet the concept of same-sex marriage had traveled so rapidly that when a French couple decided to marry, they wanted to advertise it in English. And this is something special, given the way the French feel about language, and particularly about their own language. Now, the first point I'm going to make is that contentious language is sometimes born out of accidents, historical accidents, and then it takes on a meaning of its own. Consider the boycott, which means to refuse to have dealings with a person, an organization, or a group, or to refuse to buy a product as a protest or a means of coercion, to boycott foreign produce. The word boycott, we all know today, it comes accidentally into the language because it was the name of a land agent called Charles Boycott in 19th century Ireland, who refused to lower the rent of his tenants. And the tenants and the people in the town responded by refusing to speak to him or have any dealings with him. And from that time on, this practice of non-cooperation came to be called the boycott. And the term rapidly diffused and became nearly universal. England, the United States at first, of course, then Holland, France, Germany, Italy, Sweden, and Spain all accepted versions of the term boycott because with the practice of the boycott came the language that signified it, and it helped people to communicate about the forms of contention they wished to use. Recently, by the way, there's been a variation in the term boycott. In English, buycott. B-U-Y-C-O-T-T. And the meaning of that is groups which agree to purchase a particular product because that product is green, rather than boycotting products that they don't want to use. They will purchase a product that they consider politically acceptable. The same accidental beginnings we can see in the Spanish language in the word for rompehuelgas, and I apologize for misspelling rompehuelgas. In Catalan, the word for strikebreaker is l'esquirol. Now, how does it happen that somebody who breaks a strike is called a squirrel? It has nothing to do with squirrels. It had to do with the fact that strike breakers came from an area called l'Esquirol in Catalonia, from a town called Santa Maria del Corcó, who substituted for the workers who were on strike in a factory in 1852. And from that point on, the word esquirol began to serve as the general term for strikebreaker in Spain. Did I go too far? Now, some contentious words don't survive from the cycles of protest that produced them. Here's an example from my own country. In the 1960s, there was a radical feminist movement, and many of these feminists began their political activism in groups of the New Left, in which men were the leaders and regarded women as not very important and not very useful. I could say more, but I do not want to. The term male chauvinist pig was invented by feminists to describe men who refused to give women an equal role in their movements. It came from the radical phase of the US feminist movement. But the term disappeared as the feminist movement became more institutionalized, and it became more important to form coalitions with progressive groups on the left, men and women, than to oppose male chauvinism. And so the term disappeared as a term of political discourse, but it survived in popular culture to mean an extreme form of a term you know well, machismo. This table, this figure, comes from the Ngram reader of Google Books in English between 1960 and 2008. It surveys the use of the terms male chauvinist and male chauvinist pig in books in English between those years. And as you can see, the term rises in its use very rapidly in the early 1970s, and then it gradually declines, and it virtually disappears as a term of political discourse. So some contentious words do not survive the cycles of protest that produce them. But others become generalized and widely diffused. Here's an example that has been studied in detail by my colleague and friend Connie Rogeband. Sexual harassment is a term that was invented by an American law professor, Catherine McKinnon, and it was accepted by the American Agency for Equal Employment Opportunity, and then it spread to Europe in different forms, most of which, in one way or another, relate to the American term sexual harassment. That has become a cardinal point of American law, and by virtue of the actions of the European Commission, it has become an important point in European law as well, and has been legitimated by the European Court of Justice. So we have to ask, what is it that makes some words for contentious politics survive while other words disappear? And my work has uncovered two main mechanisms. The first I call symbolic resonance, and it's the resonance of a new term with culturally familiar symbols or frames. The second concept is strategic modularity, the degree to which a word that emerges in one strategic context can be adapted to others. And my book is based on the intersection of these two concepts to form the familiar sociological device of a four-cell table and a hypothetical typology of what it is which helps particular language to survive, whether the strategic modularity is low or high, or the symbolic resonance is low or high. In the rest of this talk, I'm going to discuss two different terms that have both gained great symbolic resonance over the past 2 centuries, as well as great strategic modularity. The first is the strike, the classical term for the withdrawal of labor to put pressure on management, and it has come to signify all forms of industrial action. The second is citizen and citizenship, which began its history in ancient Greece and Rome to mean residents of a city, which then came to mean those who defended their city, then those who possessed the rights of citizenship, particularly civil and political rights, and more recently, the term has been applied in some countries to describe collective indigenous rights. So let's begin with the strike, which originally did not have the significance of a withdrawal of industrial labor. In English, it had two basic meanings. First, to strike out at something or someone, or to hit something. And the second meaning, which turns out to have been the most important one in the history of industrial conflict, to lower a sale. Strikes diffused across the English working class in the late 18th century. And their first use was in 1768 in the Port of London, when sailors lowered the sails of their ships. They struck the sails so that the ship would not be able to sail. But by the 1770s, the term strike had spread from ships to a general term for industrial action. By 1772, we can read in the Newgate calendar, quote, "These disgraceful tumults and the timidity of government spread disaffection into all classes of mechanics," that is, workers, "who, thinking the time at hand when they mid accept what wages they pleased, struck their work." By the 1770s, the term to strike had lost its nautical meaning, its maritime meaning, and had come to mean the withdrawal of labor in general. And the term strike diffused across territory, from England to the United States, where we first find it used in 1810, from England to Germany and Sweden, and through Germany to Austria, Hungary, Serbia, and Croatia, where the same term in slightly different linguistic forms comes to mean industrial action by the middle of the 19th century. We see a similar history in the French term grève, which also had an accidental origin. The term grève, for strike, didn't always mean the withdrawal of labor. The meaning of the term, which I think is similar in Spanish, and certainly is similar in Portuguese, meant the gravel on the shore of the Seine River, where provisions arrived by boat and men without work waited on the gravel looking for work. They were called grévistes. But from workers who were looking for work, the term eventually evolved to mean workers who would not work, that is, who removed themselves from work. Faire grève. And once adopted in Paris, the term for striking spread across France and elsewhere. Here's a partial list of the transnational diffusion of the word grève to Romania and Portugal. It missed Spain somehow. And obviously to Turkey. Now, why obviously to Turkey? The first two countries speak Romance languages, so it was logical that the term grève should be transferred to those two countries. But why Turkey? In Turkey, there was a perfectly serviceable Arabic word meaning the withdrawal of labor. Why did people start using the word grève? And I think the answer was because Turkish intellectuals on the left, when they went abroad to study, went to Paris. And when they came home, they wanted the most modern and the most Western term they could find for the withdrawal of labor, so they adopted the French word. Now, once it was invented, the term strike expanded to mean all forms of industrial action. In a book by Jeremy Brecher, The Great Upheaval of 1877 in the United States, I did a content analysis of the uses of the term strike as we would interpret them today, and this is what I found. In only 15% of the cases was he actually describing what we would technically call a strike, the withdrawal of labor. In many other cases, he was describing the turnout of the public to participate in strike, marches of strikers, public meetings, occupations, blockades, and attacks. The history of the term strike illustrates one of the main points of my talk. Language of contention is polysemic, and as it diffuses, it changes its meaning. It tends to expand its meanings. And we will see when we turn from the strike to the term citizen and citizenship that that term too has expanded. Now, why was the strike so successful? Let's think back to the two mechanisms I listed at the beginning of my talk: symbolic resonance and strategic modularity. The term had symbolic resonance because workers who went on strike could feel themselves to be part of a tradition going back to the historic industrial actions of the past. Strikes also developed a ritual quality. Marching, singing, banging pots and pans. And those of you who are in Connie's class will hear more about this when I meet with you tomorrow, when I will talk about the particular Latin American version of banging pots and pans, which gives a ritual quality to the strike. The term strike also retained its aggressive meaning of striking out or hitting, even when strikes became legal and peaceful. Excuse me for a moment. The strike also had strategic modularity. Striking developed a legal structure and an ultimate state acceptance of its legitimacy. It also gave workers the strategic advantage that they could stop production by putting down their tools. And it could spread through the adoption of similar techniques across an entire sector of industry or an entire economy, and even go beyond the working class. For example, the concept of student strikes. Now, when students go on strike, you're not exactly removing your labor. What you're removing is the legitimation of the university system. When I did my research on the protests of the 1960s in Italy, I found a large number of strikes that had very little to do with the removal of labor. For example, the strikes of mental patients in hospitals, the strikes of prostitutes, the strikes in Naples of the young men who sold cigarettes illegally. Now, that really expands the meaning of the strike. And the reason for this is the term strike has gained such symbolic resonance that people will use the term even for forms of action that have nothing to do with labor. Now let me turn to my second concept. It's one that you may not think of as being part of contentious politics. But in fact, it began its history, at least in the global north, as a term of contention. Because before the French and American revolutions, members of the population were not citizens, they were subjects. The original meaning of the term citizen did not have anything to do with politics, it had to do with residence. It meant you were the resident of a city. It also came to mean that you enjoyed rights and duties that came with residence in a city, including the duty of defending that city, which we find in Machiavelli in his concept of the citizen militia. And with democratization, participation in governance added still a third meaning to citizenship. And that's the meaning of citizenship that we tend to give it today. Citizenship has differentiated meanings. Evelina Danino, the Brazilian political sociologist, writes, citizenship is a historical construct, culturally based, that expresses concrete interests and practices not previously defined by any universal essence. Its contents and meanings constitute a response to the dynamic of the conflict and political struggle lived by a particular society at a given historical moment. Let's take a given historical moment. France, during the decade of the French Revolution, where citizenship gains its modern concept, and it also gains the contradictions that we still see in citizenship today. Citizenship in the French Revolution reflected all three of Dagnino's meanings. It was a product of political struggle in a particular society in a given historical moment. The political struggle was both internal and external, and it gave citizenship to some subjects and not to others. And each new political elite that came to power strove to delegitimize the one before it by removing the rights of citizenship from that group. The good citizen, did I go the wrong way? The good citizen dressed simply, paid taxes, supported the revolution, served in the army, and of course, was a man. There was talk of citizenship for women at the beginning of the revolution because women were crucial actors at the beginning of the revolution. They marched to Versailles to demand bread from the king. But when the delegates to the National Assembly met to write a constitution in August of 1789, what did they call that declaration? It was the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen, and women were excluded. Despite the fact that women formed political clubs and engaged in political debates in the course of the revolution, they were denied citizenship throughout. Now, women were not the only ones denied citizenship. Aristocrats could not have citizen rights. Those who avoided paying taxes and opposed the revolution had no citizen rights, and those who avoided military service could have their citizenship rights removed. Because this was a particular historical moment. France was not only engaged in a domestic revolution, it was soon surrounded by enemies on all sides. It was attacked by Austria and Prussia, and eventually by Britain and Russia. And it was in desperate need of a mass army. And this led to an evolution of the term citizen. Citizenship was universal in concept, but it was divisive in implementation. And it was militarized. The good citizen would defend la patrie by joining the levée en masse, the mass conscription, the world's first example of mass conscription. Citizenship became an instrument of mass mobilization. The citizen army tied male citizens to the state and to each other through education, mobility, and more than anything, a sense of belonging to a common community. This is what Rousseau had to say about citizenship in his notes for the Constitution of Poland. As soon as a public service ceases to be the main business of citizens, and they prefer to serve with their pocketbooks rather than their persons, the state is already close to ruin. Citizenship was divisive as well as unifying. The Parisian sans-culottes fought against the provincial Girondins. The good Republican fought against the bad aristocrat. The Parisian Republic fought against the Vendée counter-revolution, and the citizen army fought against the invader. Now, the concept of the citizen has had varying seasons of rise and fall. In recent years in the United States, the original Republican meaning has given way to a nativist meaning. Citizenship means not being an immigrant. In France, there's an even greater narrowing of the term. Les Français de souche, meant to exclude all those who are not born in France even if they're citizens. Where we do find a renaissance of the term citizenship talk is in Latin America since the transition from authoritarianism. And that's what I want to say a little bit about, with apologies because my knowledge of Latin American politics is very slight. But it was interesting when I first looked up the term citizenship in Latin America, I found this quote from Bolivar, who interestingly returns to Machiavelli, to the republican concept of the citizen as somebody who will defend the homeland. And he explicitly makes reference to citizenship in Rome, Greece, Venice, Genoa, Switzerland, Holland, and most recently, I think he was writing in 1812, in North America, where he opposes the concept of the citizen army to tropas mercenarias, to mercenary troops, just as Machiavelli had done 350 years earlier. Now, I'm not going to try and survey 200 years of citizenship in Latin American history, except to say that the liberal revolutions of the 19th century gave theoretical citizenship to everyone, but denied it in practice to large minorities or even majorities, especially indigenous people. And my source here is a wonderful article by, I think, an Ecuadorian historian called Liberal Discourse and the Miserable Indian Race, in which he describes the discourse of citizenship in the late 19th century in Carlos de la Torres, Ecuador reader. But the term citizenship really becomes interesting in Latin America from the time of the beginning of the transition to democracy, when the defeat of authoritarianism brings about a renaissance of the concept of the citizen. According to Dañino, the term was increasingly adopted since the 1980s and 1990s by popular movements, by excluded sectors, trade unions, and left parties as a central element of their political strategies. As with the strike, did I miss something? As with the strike, as the concept diffuses, it differentiates its meaning. I won't try and read that for you. You can read it yourselves. My horrible Spanish would probably fracture it in any case. But the point is that from a meaning that was connected to the struggle for democracy among social movements in Latin America, the term citizenship begins to expand in its meanings as it diffuses. On the left, for example, civil and political rights begin to gain favor, as Deborah Yashar writes in her survey of Latin American indigenous politics, whereas the left has prioritized material and social rights above all else, it has moderated this stance in the third wave of democracy. In tandem with this moderation, we've seen the left privileging political and civil rights that it once understood in largely instrumental terms. But the term citizenship has not remained the discourse of social movements. It has diffused from social movements to official discourse. The term begins to appear in the declarations of bureaucracies, of parliamentarians, of mayors, and of presidents. In Brazil, the term appears as a modifier for the Constitution. In Chile, it appears as a modifier for the government. And in one country that you know about, it appears as a modifier for the term revolution. And I am certainly not going to try and tell you anything about that you don't already know. In conclusion, the diffusion of the term citizenship has produced ambiguities in the meanings of citizenship. Dagnino writes, there is a perverse confluence between the use of citizenship by social movements in order to broaden and deepen democracy and its use as part of a neoliberal market discourse that requires the shrinking of the social responsibilities of the state. So let me conclude by summarizing what I hope I have said, and I hope you will agree, in the last 45 minutes. Citizenship, like the strike, is polysemic. Its meanings changed with the historical period and with the political context in which it was used. It adapts to structural contexts like industrialization and state building, but it responds more directly to political opportunities and constraints, as in post-authoritarian Latin America, in which its meanings expanded from individual rights to collective indigenous rights. And finally, it both unifies and divides. The citizenship of the post-authoritarian social movements is not the same as the citizen constitution or the citizen revolution. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias, profesor Tilly, por su conferencia. Tarrow, perdón.
That's all right. I take that as a compliment.
Es una confusión que, digamos, que ha estado dando vueltas, ¿no? Bueno, la idea era abrir, después de la conferencia, una ronda de intervenciones, de preguntas, de comentarios a la presentación del profesor Tarrow, para generar este intercambio de ideas, de inquietudes a propósito de lo que hemos escuchado esta tarde, ¿no? La importancia de las palabras y del lenguaje en la política contenciosa. De modo que abro el espacio para que las personas puedan formular sus preguntas, sus reflexiones sobre el tema que acabamos de escuchar. Ninfa, por favor. Necesitamos un micrófono.
Bueno, primero, muchísimas gracias por la conferencia y por su presencia aquí en FLACSO Ecuador. Yo quería preguntarle al profesor cómo él analizaría una diferencia entre el concepto ciudadanía como una categoría de la sociología política versus la ciudadanía, como lo hemos analizado en esta charla, como una expresión de los movimientos sociales que es polisémico y varía de acuerdo al contexto histórico y el contexto de oportunidades que existe en un momento dado.
Sí, vamos a responder una a una las preguntas porque eso, digamos, facilita el trabajo del profesor.
Well, we're going to try and answer the questions as they come up. This is a difficult question because it tries to relate two different forms of intellectual enterprise. The first is political sociology, and the second is what we can broadly call cultural studies. Now, let me back up for a moment and say I come from political sociology. And I have always had certain doubts about cultural studies because I've always found cultural approaches to be unpolitical. I've always found cultural studies to base themselves too deeply on discourse and insufficiently on politics. And what I try to do in this book is to bring together the two approaches, the sociological approach and the cultural approach. And although I didn't use these terms, my two mechanisms, which I use to explain the persistence of contentious language, come from each of these traditions. Strategic modularity is a concept that comes from political sociology, and symbolic resonance comes from cultural studies. And I try and bring these two together to try and understand the origins and the survival of different forms of contentious language. Now, in the political sociological tradition, my great teacher when I was a graduate student at Berkeley was Reinhard Bendix, who wrote, I think, the best book on citizenship called Citizenship and Nation Building. And he worked in the tradition of T.H. Marshall, the great British scholar of different forms of citizenship. Bendix's work linked citizenship to the state. And it was in the historical development of the European state that citizenship evolved. And it evolved as an extension of rights from the state. That is, citizenship was offered by the state to subjects, turning them into citizens. But as a student of social movements, I believe that that is a very partial approach to citizenship. I believe that citizenship was historically constructed by the subjects of history as well as extended by the state. In other words, as we might say about the concept of the working class, citizenship was constructed by those who made citizenship into its current form today, but they didn't do so alone. They did so interacting with the state that granted the rights of citizenship in response to struggle. I gave you an example of this at the beginning of my talk with the French state's unwillingness to accept the term grève, because for them, the grève meant working class power. And they preferred to talk about plots and conspiracies. And they only accepted the word grève when the working class became strong enough to impose that term on the state. Now, this imposition was an imposition that was at the same time strategic and cultural. Strategically, the grève was important to workers because it communicated a form of collective action. But symbolically, it was also important because it conferred social citizenship rights on the citizen. And it's only by looking at the evolution of these forms of language in their political and strategic contexts that we can bring together political sociology and cultural studies. I hope that begins to answer your very good and very important question. Thank you for it. I hope I haven't silenced everyone by giving too long an answer. I promise to give shorter answers in the future.
Sí, adelante, por favor.
Muchísimas gracias. Yo tengo una inquietud. ¿Cómo se analiza en este esquema la intencionalidad en las palabras? Porque estoy pensando, por ejemplo, el hecho de que el adjetivo ciudadano esté en la revolución de la pantalla, no es trivial. Hay una intencionalidad por parte de una élite que una vez que existe una palabra, se apodera de esa palabra y trata de darle cierto significado. Si una palabra ya tuvo resonancia, entonces a lo mejor hay una élite que trata de impulsar ciertas cosas. ¿Cómo se analiza esto dentro del esquema que usted nos está proponiendo?
Thank you for a very, very interesting question. And I will not try and answer the question in Ecuadorian terms, but I will ask you to reflect on the example I used of the French Revolution. In the French Revolution, the term citizen was unimportant at the beginning of the revolution. The word that was much more important was the word patriot. And it's a very interesting usage because it came to the French by way of the Dutch and American revolutions. The American revolutionaries called themselves patriots, and the Dutch Revolution was called the Patriot Revolution. And that term returned to France because, of course, its origin was French. La patrie is a French term. It returned to France with the political meaning of being a revolutionary. And in the first years of the revolution, we hardly hear the term citizenship used. We hear the term patriot. The term citizen becomes important after the radical break in the French Revolution in 1792, when Robespierre and the Jacobins come to power. And they come to power and impose the term citizenship on the Republic. And it replaces the term patriot. And this was no accident, because you could use the term citizen to build solidarity between the elite and the masses. You could define what a good citizen looked like, and you could shape the concept of citizenship according to the goals of the regime, which were the goals of mass mobilization and mobilization against the enemy. So citizenship became a tool of statecraft, as opposed to patriot, which was a term of revolution. And I will make no parallels for Ecuador today, but you have mentioned the term elite, and it is striking how the term citizen revolution has become part of the discourse of the Ecuadorian political elite today.
Agustín.
Who is this?
I have two interrelated questions. The first one is if this combination of cultural studies and political sociology constitutes a shift in your own work. And you know, I was pleased. I work with Belina Dañino, Arturo Escobar, Sonia Alvarez, etc. And I was pleased to hear you enter into a dialogue, active dialogue with Evelina, etc. So it's interesting to see if you see that there is a shift or a development in your own work. The other question is, I was thinking, and take the opportunity to mention Stuart Hall, who we just lost, and who his work can be seen as a bridge between political economy, political sociology, and cultural studies. And he used to define citizenship as a kind of barometer of the quality of being part of a political community according to three different criteria, no? Which is entitlements and rights, belonging and identity and participation. And if in that polysemic at the same time, developing a category of citizenship that is more complex and more shifting, but a category of political analysis, how do you see the component of identity, which is very important for Latin American social movements?
Thank you very much.
Si quieren me puedo traducir yo mismo. No sé si tradujeron.
Para no correr riesgos.
Well, first of all, congratulations on your excellent English. And you've asked a question that is very thought-provoking. As you may have guessed, Stuart Hall is one of my heroes. And his work is one of the inspirations for the kind of work I'm now trying to do. But one of the things that I find so disappointing is that very few scholars who have taken the cultural turn have continued Stuart Hall's bridge building between political sociology and cultural studies. We social scientists don't like to build bridges. We like to blow them up. We don't like to draw upon different traditions. We like to choose a theoretical approach and attack the other approaches. And in French, this is what we call de bonne guerre. It's a fun game for academics to do. And it is very difficult to try and draw upon different traditions, as I'm trying to do in this book. And one of the surprising, well, you may not be surprised, but one of the surprising issues in the reception of this book in the United States is that cultural scholars do not accept it as true cultural studies. And political sociologists regard me as a traitor. So here I am sitting, as we say, in between two stools. Instead of building a bridge, I'm in danger of falling in between the two of them. And you will, as a student of Stuart Hall's, you will appreciate this, because that's exactly what happened to many of the works in that tradition. By the way, let me cite for you a book you may not have seen, which is in Stuart Hall's tradition, and which I cite very much in this book, and it's Mark Steinberg's book about the construction of the British working class. And it's very much in Stuart Hall's tradition, and I recommend it very strongly. Thank you.
Sí.
Professor Tarrow, thank you very much for coming here. I am a little bit more interested in the roots of your study. I mean, I find very similar your interests to the perhaps early interests of the philosophy of language, which were developed perhaps in the 19th century. So I would like to ask you whether you work with some authors that were a little bit more related to philosophy, especially philosophy of language, instead of working with political scientists. Thank you.
No. But the reason for my negative answer is not because I disapprove of the philosophy of language, it's because of my relative inexperience. And I began writing this book before I had encountered the philosophy of language, and I felt that it was too sophisticated for me to try and grapple with in writing this book. But as I say at the very end of the book, there are many scholars who know more about language than I do, and I invite them to respond to the book. And I hope that they will do so. Thank you.
Hola, sí, mi pregunta va en relación a la ampliación de la ciudadanía que sugería que se produce en los 80 y 90 en América Latina, y lo que me interesaba saber es que si encuentra alguna conexión con la globalización y en general con la producción de bienes culturales y las nuevas tecnologías.
As I said at the beginning, I do not claim to be an expert on Latin America at all, and the few comments I made in my talk about Latin America come from a very recent and very partial reading, and I'm sure my colleagues here will suggest many more things that I should be reading for a study of this kind. But I do think that technology is having an amazing double effect on the diffusion of contentious language. And that double effect is this. In the first place, technology, and in particular social media, are producing a much more rapid diffusion of contentious language than we have seen in the past. Contentious language always diffused through technology. The technology of the printing press, the technology of the inexpensive newspaper, the technology of radio, television, transistor radios. Technology has always had a role in the diffusion of contentious language and of contentious practice. But social media has accelerated the rate of diffusion. If we think back to the first major episode in Latin America in which there was a diffusion of contentious language, I think it was probably the rebellion in Chiapas in 1994. And that was when email and the internet first begins to be used, and there's a creation of a network of sympathizers with the Zapatista rebellion throughout Latin America, North America, and Western Europe. What was interesting about this was that this network took several months to form. Several months. Much faster than in the past, but mostly it took the form of the transmission of newspaper articles. For example, I was in Italy at the time, and I was reading an Italian newspaper, La Repubblica, which is the major center-left-wing newspaper, and I found an article about the Zapatista rebellion. And I shared this article with a colleague of mine who is a Mexicanist, Judy Hellman, who works on Mexican politics, and she said, yes, I saw the same article in La Jornada 2 days ago. So you could already see that there was a rapid acceleration, but there was a mixture of old technologies like the printing press and new technologies like the internet. Now, when we see the diffusion of the Arab Spring or of the Indignados from Spain, it's a matter of days and even hours that this language has diffused around the world. Think of the American Occupy movement. Some of my students did a study of the diffusion of the Occupy movement throughout the United States and discovered that within 10 days, it had diffused to over 30 different cities. And unlike the diffusion of movements in the past, this diffusion did not take an incremental linear form. It spread all over the country rapidly because of the internet. So the first point I want to make in answer to your question is these concepts diffuse very quickly. But there's a second aspect, which I mentioned towards the end of my book, which is more troubling. And that is the diffusion of contentious language has happened much more rapidly, but it's possible that it's done so at the cost of the sophistication and the subtlety of language. It's possible that in order to communicate rapidly across national boundaries, contentious language has become simplified, almost to the point of vulgarization. And that means that while the form of the protest can diffuse, for example, occupy, the content of the contention does not always diffuse along with the language of contention. And that's something I think we need to worry about. We also need to worry about the fact that states control language through technology much more effectively than citizens. And that's something we're only just beginning to understand. So that the control of discourse may give the impression of a social movement when it is actually a social movement from above.
Yo tengo una pregunta. Digamos, en esta difusión del lenguaje contencioso, en este paso de las palabras de un contexto a otro contexto, esas palabras también vienen cargadas de un repertorio de acción. Digamos, generan innovaciones en las prácticas y en las acciones de aquellos actores que incorporan ese lenguaje, es decir, no solo el sentido y el significado que puede tener la incorporación de una palabra para desarrollar demandas, para plantear exigencias, sino mi pregunta es, ¿también vienen cargados de un paquete, digámoslo así, de repertorios de acción?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So, when I began this talk, you will remember that I began by talking about the repertoire of contention rather than the repertoire of language. And my great teacher, with whom you confused me,
I'm sorry for that.
I am flattered. What he was focusing on was contentious action. In fact, if you look at the first book in which he used the concept, it was Contentious Politics in Britain, and what he said was he was studying contentious gatherings, the way people gather contentiously. And he paid very little attention to language. That book was published in 1995. In 2008, he went back to the data set that he had gathered over a 20-year period about contentious politics in Britain, and he analyzed the words that people were using. So he made an epistemological shift from action to language. And that was the inspiration for this book, because he wrote that book just before he died. And he never really did have a chance to return from contentious language to contentious practice. So what you have asked is the most fundamental question. Would it make any difference if the strike had not been called a strike? Would people strike differently? Would they strike less? Would they strike more? We don't know. Because ever since 1768 in the Port of London, a strike has been called a strike. What we do know is that language communicates, and it communicates at two different levels, it seems to me. First, it communicates about what to do. Striking is a form of action, and using the term strike tells people what's expected of them. But it also communicates something else, which is ultimately, I think, more important. It communicates solidarity. It communicates a community of action as well as a community of discourse. And that community of action is not only action within the factory, but it's action between factories, and it's action between economic sectors and across space. And that was how Occupy diffused as rapidly as it did. It was not simply because it told people what to do, it told people that if they did so, if they occupied public space, they would be part of a community of action with those young people in New York who occupied Wall Street. And I think it's in that double sense that there's a feedback of language into action. It's not just that language tells you what you can do, it tells you that you are in a community, what my colleague and friend Ben Anderson called an imagined community, with others like yourself, who you imagine are doing something in the same way as you are.
Buenas.
Sí.
Mi pregunta también tiene que ver con la relación entre lenguaje y repertorios de acción. Entendiendo que la modularidad estratégica tiene que ver con la aplicabilidad a distintos contextos de acción, me pregunto si existe una relación entre la eficacia política de esas prácticas que están en esos contextos de acción y que el término se arraigue, en que se dé efectivamente ese proceso de modalidad estratégica, si hay algún efecto en fortalecer la difusión, en ampliar la difusión.
I hear you use the word efficiency? Efficiency. Okay. So, this is the book I did not write, but which I would have liked to have written, and that is, I said at the beginning of my talk that a repertoire will survive because people have used it before and because it is known to succeed. And this gets to your concept of efficiency. It's known to succeed, but it's also known not to fail. Let me give you an example. After the 1848 revolution in France, where the Republicans were defeated by Napoleon III, who organized a coup d'etat, Republicans throughout southern France began to organize demonstrations. And they demonstrated with their guns. So what happened? The army had bigger guns. And the army attacked and defeated the Republicans. And the performance of the armed demonstration disappears from French history after that. People will use arms against their opponents, but not in an open demonstration. By a demonstration, I mean a march. People were marching with their arms, and the army had bigger arms and defeated them. So from that time onward, the demonstration became a peaceful occupation of space. And there's wonderful research on this, which demonstrates how it became a peaceful demonstration. Why do I give you this example? I give you this example because the inefficiency of the armed demonstration was demonstrated. Whereas at the same time in France, the efficiency of the barricade was also demonstrated. The barricade first appears in the 1830 revolution in local forms. In the 1848 revolution, it appears again in much more organized forms. And by 1871, with the Paris Commune, the barricade is not only organized locally, but translocally. People come from all over Paris to join particular barricades. It becomes an organized form of protest that goes beyond the neighborhood. The efficiency of the barricade had been demonstrated. And among others, it was demonstrated to the French state, which rebuilt Paris and cut broad avenues across Paris so that the cannons of the French army could destroy the barricades. So I guess what I'm saying is there is no linear answer to the question of efficiency and inefficiency. Each phase of the development of the repertoire of contention is met by a new phase of repression and social control. And that forces social movements to move beyond their original form, to invent new forms as well. Consider, for example, and I don't want to give away too much because I'll talk about this in my next lecture. Consider the anti-war movement in the United States since the beginning of the Iraq War in 2003. It has taken a number of forms. Each form was met by a response from the government. Not a violent repressive response, but certainly a response that was intended to defeat the movement. And ultimately, the only form that has proven to be successful in challenging the militaristic policies of the United States since 2001 has been the use of electronic eavesdropping and electronic control. Each phase of the anti-war movement was met by a governmental response leading to a new phase and ultimately leading to Edward Snowden and his form of electronic eavesdropping. So there is no permanent answer. The dialogue between efficiency and response continues throughout history.
Bueno, muchísimas gracias, profesor, por el inicio de por este tan interesante inicio de este ciclo de conferencias, a ustedes por asistir y esperamos seguirles viendo en las próximas conferencias. Muchas gracias. Thank you very much.